somewhere in central Italy. If you could stand on a hillside on a quiet night and look out over the dark valleys below, you might feel like you're seeing something older than history. Older than the Forum, older than the legions, older than the name Rome itself. The olive trees whisper the same stories they have always told. Yet on one particular evening, the very counting of those stories broke. It was the 4th of October, 1582. And for people going about their lives in towns and villages across Europe, that night carried an odd weight they could not yet name. They went to bed under familiar stars, the moon sliding through its ordinary phases, and when they rose the next morning, the world had simply moved forward without them. 10 days had been taken away while they slept. Farmers who mark the seasons by the tilt of light across their fields woke to find saints' days. And market schedules shifted without explanation. A labourer expecting his weekly wage on the 5th suddenly discovered the 6th had arrived instead, and the landlord still demanded the full rent. Mothers planning a child's baptism consulted the old almanac only to learn the chosen feast had vanished into the gap. Clocks chimed louder to announce the change. The bells rang at the same hour they always had, yet the date they marked was now different. Some people felt a quiet disorientation, as though a small piece of their own story had been quietly edited while their eyes were closed. Others simply shrugged and continued, trusting that the priests and scholars who ordered the correction knew what they were doing. The strangeness lay not in any dramatic event, but in the silence of it. No armies marched, no comets streaked the sky to warn of the deletion. Time simply stood still for those 10 days, and then resumed on the 15th, as though nothing had happened. In the villages, the pigs still rooted in the same earth, the bread still baked in the same ovens. Yet the calendar that had guided baptisms, marriages, and tax collections, for centuries now carried a deliberate whole. People who had never left their valley suddenly found themselves living in a new arithmetic that reached all the way to the distant offices of Rome. It is curious how such an invisible adjustment could ripple outward through ordinary hours. If you pause for a moment and consider your own evening, wherever you happen to be right now, you might notice the same quiet thread connecting us. Where are you listening from tonight? What time does your clock show? Drop a note in the comments if you feel like sharing. Crust. It is always interesting to picture the different corners of the world where these words are drifting through headphones or speakers at this very instant. Someone may be hearing this under the same stars that looked down on those Italian hills in 1582, while another listener watches dawn break on the far side of the ocean. The globe keeps turning, yet the numbers we attach to its turning have never been entirely fixed. That single night in October, therefore, becomes a doorway into something larger, realization that the days we treat as solid ground were once rearranged by human hands. People who lived through the shift could not see the future ripples any more clearly than we can see how our own calendars might one day be adjusted again. They simply woke, looked at the new date, and carried on with the same sunlight falling across the same fields. In that carrying on lies the real story of how time, when it appears to stand still, actually continues in its patient, unconcerned way. Long before those 10 days slipped away in the quiet of an October night, the counting of seasons had already been reshaped by one man's hand, in a city that still smelled of fresh stone and river mud. If you let your thoughts drift backward across the centuries, Past the Renaissance bells and the medieval cloisters, you arrive at a Rome where the months themselves had grown unruly. The old republican calendar, tied to the moon, and the whims of priests, who sometimes added or subtracted days for political favour, had drifted so far that spring festivals arrived in winter, and the harvest moon rose when fields were bare. Julius Caesar, fresh from campaigns that had carried him across Gaul and into the heart of Egypt, decided the disorder could no longer stand. In the year we now call 46 BCE, he ordered a correction so sweeping that the Romans themselves named it the Year of Confusion, stretching the calendar to 445 days, simply to realign the sun's path with the festivals that honoured it. The new system he introduced was elegant in its simplicity. 365 days would form the ordinary year, divided into months whose lengths roughly matched the sun's slow journey through the constellations. Every fourth year an extra day would be inserted, single additional sunrise granted, so the calendar would not fall behind the actual turning of the earth. That extra day, placed after the sixth day, before the calends of March, and therefore called bissextile, was the ancestor of our leap years. To Roman ears it sounded almost mathematical that the solar cycle, was not a neat 365 days, but something slightly longer, something that required this periodic gift of time. At the moment of its creation, the arrangement felt nearly perfect. Caesar had consulted astronomers from Alexandria who had watched the Nile rise and fall against the fixed stars for generations their measurements suggested. The sun returned to the same point in the sky after 365 days, and roughly 1/4. Quarter was the crucial detail. By adding 1 day every 4 years, the new calendar absorbed that fraction without fanfare. Farmers could plant according to the same dates, year after year. Priests could celebrate the same festivals without watching them slide through the seasons. Soldiers could be paid, and taxes collected on schedules that no longer needed constant adjustment by magistrates. For a people who had watched their sacred days wander like unmoored boats, Julian calendar offered the reassuring sensation that the heavens themselves had been brought into agreement with human law. Yet even then, in the marble halls where the reform was proclaimed, there were quiet uncertainties. The astronomer's quarter day was itself an approximation. True solar year is a few minutes shorter, a detail too small to notice in a single lifetime, but large enough to accumulate across centuries. Caesar could not have known how that tiny remainder would one day press against the very dates he had tried to fix. In the immediate years after the reform, however, such distant consequences lay beyond anyone's horizon. The olive groves on those central Italian hillsides continued their slow growth under a sky that now matched the months more closely than it had for generations. Armies marched with calendars that no longer contradicted the seasons they travelled through. The extra day every 4 years became part of the ordinary rhythm of life, accepted with the same quiet trust that later generations would place in the dates printed in almanacs and prayer books. What Caesar could not have foreseen was how his seemingly permanent solution would travel outward from Rome, carried by legions and governors and missionaries, until it became the common measure of time across much of the known world. The leap year rule, simple enough for a scribe to remember, proved sturdy enough to outlast the empire that created it. For more than 16 centuries, the Julian calendar guided harvests, coronations, and voyages, its extra day appearing with the regularity of the stars themselves. Only much later would the small mismatch between its arithmetic and the actual length of the solar year become impossible to ignore, setting the stage for the night when 10 dates simply disappeared while people slept, in that long interval of apparent stability, though the Julian solution stood as one of history's most successful attempts to make the turning Earth obey a human count, and for a while it succeeded so well that almost no one remembered it had once been new. Yet, even in those first centuries of apparent harmony, when the Julian arrangement had settled like a well-worn path across the fields of Europe, and beyond, a quieter truth was already at work beneath the surface. The astronomers who advised Caesar had measured the solar return as 1/4 day, beyond the ordinary year, but the true cycle is shorter still, by 11 minutes and 14 seconds. That modest remainder, too slight to register against the turning of a single season, or the lifetime of any observer, began its slow accumulation the moment the reform took hold. Each ordinary year the calendar advanced a fraction ahead of the sun itself. Each leap year, though intended to restore balance, preserved a sliver of that excess. Over decades the difference remained invisible, matter for scribes and scholars to note in passing, if they noted it at all. Over centuries, however, grew into something that could no longer be ignored. A widening gap between the dates written on parchment and the actual position of the sun among the stars. By the early Middle Ages the drift had become perceptible in ways that touched daily life and sacred observance alike. Spring festivals, once tied to the first greening of the fields, began to arrive, while frost still clung to the ground. The autumn equinox, which had once marked the reliable moment when daylight and darkness stood equal, now fell several days earlier than the calendar indicated, so that harvest prayers were offered under skies that still felt like high summer. Monks, charged with calculating the date of Easter, found their tables drifting out of step with the moon and the sun together, forcing awkward adjustments that varied from monastery to monastery. Farmers planting by the old saints' days watched their crops respond to a different rhythm than the one written in the liturgical books. The misalignment crept forward at roughly 3 days every 400 years pace, so measured that no single generation could claim to have witnessed the change, yet steady enough that by the 12th and 13th centuries the accumulated error had reached 8 or 9 days. What had once been a calendar, aligned with the heavens, now carried its own quiet momentum, moving ahead of the seasons it was meant to describe. The effect was not dramatic at first, more like the slow leaning of an old tower whose tilt becomes visible only when compared with the straight line, a newer wall. In the great cathedrals the light of the equinox no longer struck the same carved stones it had when the masons set them in place. In the vineyards of France and the olive groves of Italy, the first pressing of the grapes arrived on dates that no longer matched the month names corded in the missals. Travellers found, crossing from one region to another, sometimes found that the feast they had left behind was still weeks away in place they arrived, or that a saint's day celebrated with solemn processions in one valley had already passed unnoticed in the next. These small dislocations did not yet threaten the order of things, but they planted a seed of unease among those whose lives depended on the calendar's accuracy. The Julian solution, so elegant in its simplicity, had begun to reveal the limit of its own arithmetic. What made the drift especially persistent was the very rule that had seemed to solve the problem forever. because the leap day was inserted every 4 years without exception, the calendar could never correct itself, could only continue adding the same small surplus year after year. The 11 minutes and 14 seconds became 11 hours, and something more to 6 decades, then nearly a full day after 4 centuries. By the time the 13th century gave way to the 14th, vernal equinox that astronomers placed around the 21st of March was occurring, according to the calendar, on the 11th or 12th. The difference was still small enough that ordinary people might not notice unless they kept careful watch, yet large enough that scholars in Bologna and Oxford began to write treatises pointing out the mismatch between observed sunrise and written date. Their warnings remained largely academic, for the machinery of daily life and continued to turn on the Julian dates. Still, discrepancy was no longer a theoretical remainder hidden in Alexandrian tables. It had become a living interval that lengthened with every generation. As the centuries advanced, the misalignment touched even the most distant edges of the world that used the Julian calendar. In the northern kingdoms, where winter darkness lasted longer, the extra days meant that the return of light arrived noticeably earlier than the calendar promised. In the Mediterranean ports, where trade followed the seasons, merchants sometimes found their contracts tied to dates that no longer matched the winds or the tides. The slow shift did not yet demand correction, but it created a growing sense that the calendar, once thought to mirror the heavens, was now running on its own separate track. That realization would eventually reach the ears of astronomers and popes alike, but for the long interval between Caesar's reform and the first serious proposals for change, the drift remained a quiet companion to the turning of the years, visible only to those who measured the sky against the page and wondered why the two no longer agreed. The question of when Easter should fall had never been a simple matter of arithmetic. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325, the bishops gathered under Constantine's patronage had sought to settle once, and for all the date of the resurrection, fixing it as the first Sunday after the first full moon that followed the vernal equinox. They chose the 21st of March as the ecclesiastical marker for that equinox, not because every astronomer agreed it would remain exact forever, but because it gave the scattered churches a single rule they could follow without constant dispute. The decision carried weight far beyond the council chamber. Easter stood at the centre of the entire Christian year, determining the fast of Lent, the joy of Pentecost, the timing of baptisms, and the movement of countless local saints' days that clustered around it. If the date drifted, the whole rhythm of worship risked coming untidy, and with it the sense that the church on earth still moved in step with the heavens that had witnessed the empty tomb. For a time the Nicaean arrangement worked well enough. The Julian calendar placed the equinox closer to the 25th of March, when the fathers met, and the computists who followed them could predict the moon's phases, with tables that seemed reliable from one generation to the next. Proud. Yet the same slow surplus of minutes that had begun accumulating in Caesar's day continued its quiet work. 11 minutes and 14 seconds each year meant that the true moment when day and night stood equal crept steadily earlier across the calendar page. By the 6th century the gap was already noticeable to anyone who watched the sky rather than the parchment. By the 8th, when Bede compiled his careful reckonings in the monastery at Jarrow, The astronomical equinox had moved several days ahead of the date the Church still treated as fixed. Bede himself noted the mismatch without alarm, recording that the sun now reached its spring balance around the 18th or 19th of March. Yet he continued to calculate Easter from the older marker, because altering it would have required a consensus, as no single scholar could command. The implications reached deeper than a few misplaced feast days. Easter had always been understood as the Christian answer to the old Passover, the moment when the Lamb of God took away the sins of the world. The calculated full moon no longer matched the actual moon in the sky, or if the equinox used in the tables no longer corresponded to the real turning of the seasons, some began to wonder whether the festival was being kept at the proper time at all. In the monasteries where the computus was taught, monks pored over lunar cycles and epacts, adjusting for the 19-year Metonic cycle and the leap years of the Julian rule, yet each adjustment only masked the underlying drift for a little longer. When Easter arrived according to the tables while snow still lay in the fields, or when it fell so late that the first green shoots had already given way to summer heat, the symbolic link between resurrection and the renewal of the earth grew harder to feel. Farmers, who had once seen the liturgical calendar as a trustworthy guide to planting and harvest, now found the two rhythms pulling apart, and the unease spread outward from the scriptorium into the wider community of the faithful. The centuries passed. The gap widened at a pace too gradual for panic, yet steady enough to demand notice. Once, by the 11th century, the true equinox had advanced nearly a week earlier than the 21st of March used in the Easter tables. Full moon, that the computists called the Paschal moon, sometimes appeared in the sky days before or after the date predicted by the old algorithms. Different regions adopted small local corrections, some advancing the equinox by a day or two in their private reckonings, others clinging strictly to the Nicaean letter. The result was occasional confusion at the borders of dioceses, where one bishop might proclaim Easter, while another still kept the Lenten fast. Such differences rarely erupted into open schism, lost. Yet they reminded every careful observer that the calendar, meant to unify the Church across languages and kingdoms, was instead beginning to carry its own small contradictions. The religious stakes grew clearer with each generation. The resurrection had been tied from the beginning to the spring equinox, because that moment marked the triumph of light over darkness, the same victory Christians saw in the empty tomb. If the date no longer aligned with the actual balance of sun and shadow, some theologians feared the feast risked losing its deepest resonance. Others worried that celebrating too early or too late might inadvertently echo older pagan spring rites rather than the distinct event of Christ's rising, proscores. The computists therefore treated their tables not as mere numbers, but as a sacred trust, and any proposal to revise them met resistance, rooted in reverence rather than stubbornness. To change the date of Easter was to touch the hinge on which the whole year turned. Few wished to risk disturbing that hinge without certainty that the heavens themselves demanded it. Still, the drift continued. With it, the quiet pressure on those responsible for announcing the date each year. In the great cathedrals, the Paschal candle was lit according to calculations that no longer matched the actual sky. Yet the flame still rose on the appointed night, and the ancient words were still sung. The gap between calculation and an observation remained small enough that most worshippers never noticed. Only the handful of scholars who kept both the missal and the astrolabe could feel how steadily the two were parting. Their observations, accumulated in marginal notes and private letters, passed from one centre of learning to another, until the accumulated weight of evidence began to press toward a larger question: whether a calendar designed to last forever could continue to serve a faith that placed such a weight on observing the right moment in the turning of the year. That question would not be answered for several more centuries, but the drift that prompted it was already shaping the devotional life of Europe long before any pope or astronomer proposed a remedy. Quiet cloisters of 13th century Europe. That question began to find voices willing to speak it aloud, scholars who kept both the missal and the astrolabe, and who could no longer ignore how the heavens themselves were drifting away from the parchment. These were not yet astronomers in the modern sense, but men trained in the quadrivium, steeped in computus and the slow discipline of nightly observation, who watched the sun's return to the equator, with instruments passed down from Arabic and Greek sources. In the libraries of Oxford and Paris, in the scriptoria of Monte Cassino and the new universities rising along the Seine, marginal notes multiplied, recording that the true equinox now arrived. Days earlier than the 21st of March, the Church still honoured. The gap was no longer a curiosity for a single monastery. It had become a shared unease passed in letters between centres of learning, each observer adding a day or two to the growing tally of lost alignment. They spoke of it cautiously, at first, for any suggestion that the fathers at Nicaea had fixed the calendar to a moment slipping away. Risked, sounding like presumption against sacred tradition. Yet the evidence mounted in star charts and eclipse records in the simple fact that spring lights reached the fields while the tables still placed the equinox in winter's shadow. Among these observers, none pressed the matter with greater urgency than Roger Bacon, the English Franciscan whose restless mind ranged across optics, alchemy, and the reform of learning itself. In 1267, he addressed a long letter to Pope Clement IV, part of the sprawling work later known as the Opus Majus, laying out with unusual directness the calendar's accumulating error. Bacon calculated that the Julian surplus of 11 minutes and 14 seconds each year had already displaced the equinox by roughly 9 days since the time of the Nicaean Council, a drift that would only widen unless corrected by papal authority. He did not frame the problem as a challenge to faith, but as a duty to preserve its accuracy, arguing that the Church's most sacred feast risked losing its proper mooring in the seasons God had ordained. The letter reached the Pope amid the political storms of the 13th century, when the papacy itself contended with emperors, kings, the rising power of the mendicant orders. Clement responded with guarded interest, granting Bacon a temporary release from Franciscan restrictions so he could continue his studies. Yet the machinery of reform never turned. Council was summoned, no bull issued. The machinery of the Church moved slowly even when a pope inclined towards scholarship, and the moment passed when Clement died the following year. Other attempts at correction surfaced in the same century, and the next, each meeting the same quiet resistance. In 1315, a group of scholars at the University of Paris presented calculations suggesting a one-day adjustment 134 years. A modest proposal that might have slowed the drift without overturning the Nicaean framework. The idea circulated in academic circles, but found no patron strong enough to impose it across dioceses. Later, in the 1430s, Council of Basel briefly considered calendar reform among its many agenda items, yet the gathering was already fractured by disputes over concilia versus papal authority. The calendar question was set aside as too divisive for a body seeking unity on larger matters. Each failure revealed the same underlying obstacle. Any change to the date of Easter or the equinox required a consensus that crossed kingdoms, languages, and the delicate balance between spiritual and temporal power. A king might enforce a new feast day within his own realm if neighbouring dioceses kept the older reckoning. Merchants would miss market days. Pilgrims would arrive at shrines on the wrong date. The very unity the calendar was meant to protect would fracture further. The political complexity ran deeper than simple inertia. The Church's calendar shaped not only worship, but the rhythms of taxation, legal terms, and agricultural contracts that bound peasants to lords across Europe. Altering it meant renegotiating agreements written in the old dates, reopening questions of inheritance and debt that had been settled for generations. Secular rulers, already wary of papal interference in their domains, saw little advantage in inviting Rome to reset the year. The formed calendar might strengthen the Pope's claim to oversee time itself. At the same time, the growing precision of astronomical tables, many translated from Arabic sources and refined in the new universities, made the error harder to dismiss as a monastic eccentricity. Scholars in Toledo and Bologna, in Krakow and Prague, compared observations across borders, and their shared data quietly undermined the notion that any single kingdom could solve the problem in isolation. The calendar had become a thread woven through the entire fabric of Christendom. Tugging at one end risked unravelling agreements no one fully understood, until they began to fray. Still the drift continued its patient work, and the scholars who noticed it most acutely found themselves caught between reverence for the past and fidelity to the skies they measured. Bacon's warning, though unheeded in its own generation, survived in manuscript xopais that later reformers would rediscover, reminder that the question had once been posed with clarity and urgency. Other voices joined the chorus in the 14th and 15th centuries, some proposing radical simplifications of the leap year rule, others suggesting that the Church simply accept a floating equinox tied to actual observations rather than a fixed date. None gained traction because each proposal carried implications for authority. Who would decide when the adjustment occurred? Who would enforce it in distant dioceses, and whose prestige would be diminished if the old tables were declared insufficient? Very success of the medieval Church in creating a shared liturgical year now made reform perilous, for any correction would expose how long the year had been allowed to wander. In the end, the alarm raised by these medieval observers did not produce immediate change. Yet it planted the seed of an idea that would not disappear. That time itself, as measured by the heavens, might require the Church to act with a boldness equal to the boldness of Julius Caesar or the Fathers at Nicaea. That idea waited for a pope willing to treat the calendar not as an untouchable inheritance, but as an instrument that could be tuned again to the turning of the world. Centuries later, that waiting would end not in the quiet scriptoria of Oxford or the lecture halls of Paris, but in the marble corridors of a Renaissance Rome, where a single pontiff chose to treat time itself as something the Church could still shape. Pope Gregory XII, born Ugo Boncompagni, and shaped by the legal precision of Bologna before his elevation, inherited a problem that had outlasted empires, and yet remained unsolved. In the early 1570s, he gathered a small commission of astronomers, mathematicians and clerics, tasking them with nothing less than restoring the equinox to its proper place, without shattering the liturgical unity still bound distant dioceses. The invitation carried the weight of centuries of hesitation. Previous popes had received similar warnings and set them aside. Yet Gregory sensed that the accumulated drift now threatened the credibility of Easter itself across a Europe already fracturing along confessional lines. Among the voices that reached the commission first was that of Aloysius Lilius, Calabrian physician and astronomer, whose quiet calculations had circulated in manuscript for years before they were formally presented. Lilius approached the problem not as a radical overhaul, but as a measured correction to both the solar year and the lunar cycle that governed Easter. He proposed trimming 10 days from the calendar to bring the vernal equinox back to the 21st of March, then altering the leap year rule so that century years would be common years unless divisible by 400. This single adjustment, he argued, would keep the calendar aligned for millennia rather than centuries, sparing future generations the same slow misalignment. His proposal arrived with supporting tables that demonstrated how the lunar impacts could be recalibrated alongside the solar correction, preserving the delicate balance required for movable feasts. Lilius did not live to see the final adoption of his scheme, yet the Commission preserved his core structure as the foundation upon which all later refinements rested, recognizing in it a rare combination of mathematical economy and liturgical fidelity. The man who ultimately gave that structure its enduring mathematical form was Christopher Clavius, the Jesuit astronomer, whose meticulous work at the Roman College transformed Lilius's outline into a workable system. Clavius brought to the task a lifetime of study in spherical astronomy and the new observational instruments that were beginning to appear in European observatories. He recalculated the length of the tropical year with greater precision than the Julian astronomers had possessed, confirming the surplus of roughly 11 minutes annually, and determining exactly how many days had been lost since Nicaea. Tables demonstrated that skipping the 10 days in October 1582 would restore the equinox without disturbing the weekly cycle of Sundays, detail that mattered deeply to those who feared any break in the unbroken rhythm of worship. Clavius also refined the century year exceptions, ensuring that the calendar would not again drift ahead by more than a day over several thousand years. His contributions were less a reinvention than a rigorous defence of Lilius's insight, proud of Faust, presented in lengthy commentaries that addressed every conceivable objection from both astronomers and theologians. The deliberations themselves stretched across nearly a decade, conducted in a series of meetings whose minutes reveal a cautious weighing of precedent against necessity. Commissioners examined earlier proposals from the 13th and 15th centuries, noting how each had founded on questions of authority and enforcement. They debated whether the correction should be applied uniformly or left to individual kingdoms, ultimately concluding that only a papal bull could impose the change across Latin Christendom. Questions of the moon's motion occupied long sessions, for any error in the epoch calculations would shift Easter by weeks rather than days. Some members advocated a more radical simplification that would abandon the golden number entirely. Yet the majority favoured preserving as much of the existing computus as possible to ease acceptance. Political considerations entered quietly. How would the reform appear to rulers already suspicious of Roman overreach? And would the omission of days disrupt contracts, tax collections, timing of fairs? The Commission tested the proposed rules against historical eclipse records and against the observed heavens of their own era, adjusting the formula until the predicted equinox aligned with actual solar observation within acceptable limits. Through these measured exchanges, the reform took its final shape, a hybrid of ancient tradition and Renaissance precision that acknowledged both the authority of Nicosia and the accumulated evidence of the skies. Gregory's commission understood that no solution could satisfy every kingdom or every scholar. Yet they proceeded because the alternative was continued drift and the gradual erosion of a shared sacred calendar. Pope reviewed their conclusions in private audiences, asking not only about the mathematics, but about the pastoral consequences for the faithful who would awaken one morning to find the date advanced. Satisfied that the correction preserved Easter's relation to the spring moon while restoring the equinox, he prepared the bull that would carry the reform into the churches and marketplaces of Europe. In that moment, the long silence that had followed, Roger Bacon's letter finally broke, not with a single dramatic decree, but with the quiet accumulation of calculations, debate, dates, and revisions that had tested the proposal against every objection the centuries could raise. The idea that had waited for a willing pope had at last found its instrument, and the turning of the world would once more be measured by tables that matched the heavens that rather than contradicted them. In the quiet workrooms where the Commission's papers lay spread beneath lamplight, real labour of correction began, not with grand pronouncements, but with the patient reckoning of how many days the sun had outrun the calendar since the Council of Nicaea. Aloysius Lilius had already seen that the excess accumulated at roughly 11 minutes each year, modest surplus, that nevertheless grew into a full day every 128 years, and into 10 days by the late 16th century. The 10 days chosen for removal were therefore no arbitrary figure. They restored the vernal equinox precisely to the 21st of March, the date fixed at Nicaea, when the moons were 14th days with the first spring full moon. Any other number would have left Easter wandering again within a generation, undoing the very harmony the reform sought to protect. Christopher Clavius took those calculations and tested them against centuries of eclipse records and against the observed position of the sun at the equinox itself, confirming that skipping the days between the 4th and 15th of October 1582 would bring the calendar back into step without fracturing the sequence of weekdays that guided both prayer and market. The deeper safeguard lay in the new rule for leap years. Under the Julian arrangement, every 4th year had been declared a leap year, producing too many extra days over time. Lilius proposed that century years would ordinarily be common years, losing their leap day, unless the century itself was divisible by 400. 400 years, the old system would have inserted 100 leap days. The new rule kept only 97. Those 3 omitted days spaced across the centuries at 1700, 1800, and 1900, removed just enough surplus to keep the calendar from drifting ahead by more than a single day, several thousand years. The arithmetic was elegant in its restraint. 3 fewer leap years per 4 centuries produced an average year length of 365.420 days, closer to the true tropical year than any previous civil calendar had achieved. Clavius's tables demonstrated that this adjustment would hold the equinox within a day of its target. For at least 4 millennia, span long enough that future astronomers could revisit the question rather than face another crisis of misplaced seasons. What made the solution durable was the care with which the lunar corrections travelled alongside the solar ones. The same commission that fixed the leap year formula also revised the epochs. The numbers that track the moon's age at the start of each year host so that Easter would continue to fall after the first full moon following the equinox. Without that paired adjustment, the solar correction alone would have shifted the movable feasts by weeks rather than restoring them. The reformers therefore preserved the ancient golden number while embedding the new solar rule inside it, ensuring that the delicate balance between sun and moon remained intact for the churches that still celebrated the resurrection according to the Tordif Greek Nicene formula. The precision of these interlocking tables astonished even the skeptics who examined them. Every predicted equinox matched recorded observations within the limits of naked eye astronomy, and the century-year exceptions were placed so that no single generation would notice the omission except as a brief adjustment once every 100 or 400 years. Yet the elegance of the mathematics could not hide the human weight of the decision. 10 days had to vanish because 10 days had already been lost. Leaving them in place would have condemned Easter to creep steadily deeper into summer, repeating the very misalignment that had prompted the reform. The Commission's final recommendation therefore carried both the authority of calculation and the humility of measured correction. A calendar that acknowledged its own imperfection, while offering a rule simple enough for parish priests and sturdy enough for future centuries. When the bull finally left the papal chambers, it carried not only the order to omit the days, but the full apparatus of leap year exceptions and epoch tables, a complete system whose internal logic had been tested against every objection the astronomers could raise. In that single document the accumulated drift of more than 12 centuries was arrested, and the turning of the seasons was once more invited to coincide with the dates the faithful had long kept in memory. Post, when the papal bull Integravissimus emerged from the Vatican presses in the closing weeks of February 1582, it carried the weight of centuries into the hands of printers and couriers, who would scatter it across the map of Catholic Europe. The document itself spoke in measured tones, announcing that 10 days must be omitted so the calendar might once again greet the sun at the proper moment. Yet it left the precise manner of that omission to the discretion of local bishops and princes. In cities from Lisbon to Krakow, the news travelled first through official channels. Sealed letters delivered by papal nuncios, who read the text aloud in cathedrals and town squares, then through hastily printed broadsheets that found their way into marketplaces and monasteries. The instruction was simple in its arithmetic, yet startling in its consequence. The day after Thursday, 4 October would be reckoned as Friday, 15 October, with every intervening date simply erased from the record. Single night between the 4th and the 15th became the hinge on which ordinary life turned. Farmers who had planned to sow winter wheat on the 5th found themselves stepping instead into fields already touched by the 15th. Merchants who kept ledgers discovered that rents due on the 10th had vanished into the same void. The deletion was communicated with remarkable speed for the era, carried by riders who changed horses at posting inns, and by ships that bore copies, ports of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. In Rome itself, the change was proclaimed from the steps of the Lateran Basilica, while in Madrid the Royal Council issued its own decree confirming that Spain and its colonies would follow the new reckoning without delay. Parishes across Italy posted notices on church doors, and in the German-speaking lands under Catholic rule, the local ordinaries arranged for the bull to be translated and explained from pulpits on successive Sundays, so that even those who could not read might understand why the saints' days they had kept since childhood would now fall on different dates. Reactions rippled outward in patterns that revealed the deep fractures already present in European society. In the Papal States and the Italian duchies, the adjustment was accepted with a mixture of relief and mild bewilderment. Astronomers and clerics, who had followed the long debates, welcomed the restoration of the equinox, while ordinary families simply adjusted their almanacs and continued marking the feasts of their local patrons. France. The royal edict met pockets of resistance among provincial nobles who resented any alteration imposed from Rome, yet the change was enforced with quiet efficiency once the Parliament of Paris had registered the bull. Spain embraced the reform with characteristic thoroughness, its vast colonial administration ensuring that the same 10 days disappeared from calendars in Mexico City and Manila almost as quickly as they vanished in Seville. Portugal followed suit within weeks, its ships carrying the new dates to outposts along the African coast and beyond. Yet even within these obedient realms, the human texture of the omission revealed itself in small dislocations. Wills that had named the 10th of October as the day of inheritance now required clarification. Contracts drawn for delivery on the 8th had to be renegotiated or annulled. Some chroniclers recorded that a few anxious souls stayed awake through the night of the 4th, watching the clocks as though the missing days might somehow reappear at dawn. Others noted that the moon still rose on its accustomed schedule, indifferent to the numbers. Humans had chosen to skip. Across Catholic Europe, the reform therefore arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a series of adjustments, each community absorbing the loss in its own rhythm, while the larger machinery of church and crown ensured that the new calendar took root before the old one could reassert its drift. The 10 days had been surrendered, but the seasons they once marked were invited to return to their proper places. And in that quiet surrender, the long conversation between sky and parchment continued under altered terms. Foon, in villages scattered across the Apennines and the plains of Castile, the night between the 4th and the 15th passed without fanfare for most households. People banked their fires, barred their doors against the autumn chill, rose and rose the next morning to find that the calendar they trusted had simply stepped over 10 dawns. Farmer in Umbria who had marked the 5th for sowing his last barley, now walked his fields beneath a moon already past its quarter, wondering whether the soil itself had noticed the absence, or whether only the ink on his parish register had been altered. Ports of Valencia and Genoa, dock workers who expected wages for the lost week, found their ledgers already closed, the columns for the 8th through the 14th left blank, as though those hours had never belonged to anyone. The change arrived not with proclamations shouted in every lane, but with the quiet realization that yesterday's obligations had evaporated while the sun continued its steady climb. Markets felt the dislocation first. In the great fairs of Luan and the smaller weekly gatherings along the Po, merchants who had travelled for days arrived to find stalls half empty because suppliers from Catholic territories had already advanced their dates, while those from border regions still counted by the old reckoning. A contract for wool due on the 10th now hung in uncertainty. One party insisted the debt had lapsed with the missing days, the other that the omission could not erase a promise sealed by handshake and witness. Bargaining continued. Yet every price carried an extra layer of negotiation, as though time itself had become a commodity subject to local decree. Sailors, returning from the Levant, discovered that their pay periods had contracted without warning, and widows, who relied on quarterly rents, learned that the 15th now claimed what the 5th had once held. The confusion was not rebellion, but friction, the small grinding of daily commerce against a reform that had been announced in measured Latin yet landed on ordinary lives like an unexpected frost. Saints' days and personal anniversaries shifted in ways that unsettled more than ledgers. A child named for Saint Teresa, whose feast had always fallen near the beginning of October, now found her celebration moved forward by 10 days, while neighbours, born on the erased dates, were left to choose whether they had come into the world on the 14th or the 15th, perhaps on neither. Families that kept careful records of baptisms and marriages consulted parish priests, who could only point to the new calendar nailed to the church door. In some households, the old dates were quietly preserved in private almanacs, creating parallel histories within the same walls. Birthdays that once aligned with the first new moon after the equinox now drifted relative to the actual sky, so that a man who had always celebrated beneath the same stars discovered the stars had stayed while the number on his tally changed. The saints themselves, it seemed, were indifferent. Their intercessions continued regardless of whether the faithful marked them on the corrected or the abandoned day. Legal documents and civic records revealed the deepest fractures, wills probated in the weeks after the reform carried dates that no longer existed, forcing notaries to insert explanatory clauses that read like apologies to future readers. Deed transferring land on the 7th of October had to be redrawn or annotated, because the 7th had been declared never to have occurred. Courts in Rome and Seville heard cases in which litigants argued over whether an event on the missing days could be cited as precedent, or whether testimony sworn on the 9th retained its force when the 9th itself had been erased. Chroniclers noted the awkwardness without drama. Few scribes simply repeated the sequence of the previous year, rather than risk inventing a day that papal authority had removed. In monasteries, the daily offices continued unbroken. Yet the marginal notes in the books of hours began to record 2 reckonings side by side, one for the heavens and one for the vanished interval. The 10 days had not vanished from memory. They lingered as gaps in parchment and memory, spaces where ordinary people had to decide, day by day, whether the new order would hold, or whether the old sequence still whispered beneath it. Across these Catholic regions, the adjustment settled into routine within a single season. Yet the texture of that first autumn remained uneven. Some communities treated the omission as a minor administrative correction, as a reminder that even the most ancient measures of time could be revised by human decree. The moon still rose, the harvest still came in, and the bells still marked the canonical hours. But the small dislocations lingered in conversations at evening tables and in the margins of account books. The reform had been engineered to restore the equinox. Yet, for those who lived through the night between the 4th and the 15th, it restored something more immediate. The recognition that the calendar they followed was not the sky itself, but a fragile agreement renewed and occasionally rewritten by those who kept the records. In the hill towns of Saxony and the market squares of Zurich, where the new calendar arrived not as a papal bull, but as rumour, carried by traders from the south, the omission of those 10 days was met less with acceptance than with a quiet hardening of resolve. The reform, after all, bore the unmistakable stamp of Rome, and for communities that had already broke with the old church, over questions of authority and scripture, accepting a corrected reckoning from the same source, felt like inviting the very power they had cast out back into the ordering of their days. Pastors preached against it, from pulpits still warm with the memory of indulgent sales and Latin masses, warning that to follow the Pope arithmetic was to submit once more to an institution that claimed dominion over both soul and season. Accusation took root quickly. This was no neutral adjustment of the heavens, but an act of popish tyranny, an attempt to bend time itself to the will of a man who styled himself successor to St. Peter. In pamphlets and sermons the language grew sharp, equating the skipped days with the skipped truths of the Reformation, as though the calendar had become another battlefield on which the old faith sought to reassert its vanished sway. Yet the refusal was rarely uniform. Some Protestant cities simply ignored the change and continued counting forward from the 4th of October, as though the 5th had followed in its proper place, creating pockets where the Julian sequence persisted unaltered, while neighbouring Catholic territories advanced. Merchants crossing the Rhine or the Alps found themselves negotiating not only prices but entire chronologies, one party reckoning by the corrected feast of St. Luke, and the other by the unaltered feast of St. Michael. Letters between scholars in Wittenberg and Basel carried dual dates for months on end, the writers adding explanatory notes that read like quiet protests, according to the old style, or as the Pope would have it. In regions where Protestant and Catholic territories lay intermingled, confusion settled into daily life with a stubborn persistence that no single decree could erase. Wedding planned for the 12th might be celebrated on what one side called the 22nd, while the other side insisted the original date still held, leaving the couple to choose which register would record their vows, and which saint would be invoked in the blessing. Over decades this dual existence became ordinary, quiet partition of time that mirrored the deeper partition of churches. The resistance was not always loud. In some villages the old calendar lingered in private almanacs and family Bibles long after official pronouncements had moved on, preserved by farmers who trusted the moon and the saints more than any distant council. Elsewhere, the new reckoning was adopted piecemeal, accepted for civil matters, while church. Festivals remained fixed to the older sequence, so that the same community might observe 2 Easters in a single year, or mark the solstice on conflicting mornings. Result was a lived patchwork rather than outright rebellion. A generation that grew accustomed to asking which calendar governed the present transaction and which governed the coming feast. Astronomers and mathematicians in Protestant lands continued their calculations without papal sanction, sometimes arriving at the same correction through independent means, yet refusing to credit the source. The mathematics could be separated from the authority that first announced it. In this way, the skip days became not merely an absence but a symbol, a reminder that even the sky's apparent order could be claimed by competing powers, and that agreement on the length of a year did not yet mean agreement on who held the right to name it. For those who lived across these divided territories, the decades brought a gradual softening rather than sudden surrender. Trade demanded some common measure, and slowly the corrected dates crept into use for contracts and correspondence, even where theological objections remained. Yet the memory of the refusal endured in private records and in the stories families told of ancestors who had kept the old saints' days alive in hidden ledgers. The 10 days that vanished overnight in Catholic lands thus lingered elsewhere as a visible fault line, a stretch of contested time, whose boundaries shifted with each border crossing, and whose final reconciliation would wait for later centuries. And compromises. The calendar, once altered, revealed itself again as something negotiated rather than discovered, its authority resting not only on the alignment of stars but on the willingness of scattered communities to accept the same count. Yet, across the Channel, in the island kingdom whose break with Rome had hardened into something more than doctrine, the same refusal settled into a longer silence. England had watched the continental patchwork unfold without feeling any urgency to mend its own thread. The Julian count, already a century and more out of step by the time Protestant cities began weighing their options, remained the quiet measure of parliamentary sessions, quarter days, and the slow turning of the exchequer. To adopt the Pope's correction would have meant conceding that an authority, once rejected, still held the power to name the seasons, and that concession felt unnecessary when the seas themselves seemed to keep foreign reckonings at bay. Merchants trading with Antwerp or Hamburg learned to carry 2 calendars in their ledgers, yet at home the old sequence continued, without interruption, its 11-day drift accepted as simply the way English time had always behaved. By the middle of the 18th century, the discrepancy had grown noticeable even to those who never left their parishes. The spring equinox arrived noticeably earlier on the calendar than in the sky, pulling Easter and its attendant fairs out of alignment with the planting cycle that farmers still trusted. Petitions reached Parliament from astronomers and navigators, who pointed out that longitude calculations, already uncertain, became still more tangled when English ships recorded dates that no longer matched the almanacs of their French or Dutch counterparts. The argument was framed less as submission to Rome than as a matter of national convenience, practical adjustment that might be enacted without acknowledging any spiritual debt. In 1750, the Calendar Act was passed, its language careful to present the change as an act of Parliament rather than a papal decree, ordaining that the day after the 2nd of September 1752 would be counted as the 14th. The announcement arrived without ceremony in most villages. No royal heralds proclaimed the coming omission. Instead, the news filtered through newspapers, almanacs, and the talk of market days. 11 days were to vanish, not 10, because Britain had waited an additional century, while the Gregorian correction continued its own slow advance. For those whose rents or wages were paid on fixed quarter days, the missing interval raised immediate questions about whether a full month's labour had been erased or merely reassigned. Some landlords posted notices insisting that Michaelmas rents would still fall on the date their tenants expected, while others demanded payment on the new reckoning, leaving ordinary households to guess which authority would prevail. When the bailiff arrived, the rumour that lives themselves would be shortened by 11 days spread quickly, repeated in letters and at tavern tables, as though the state had reached into each person's allotted span and removed a portion without consent. Riots broke out in several towns, not as organised rebellion, but as sudden gatherings of people who felt the ground of daily order shifting beneath them. In Bristol and Sunderland, crowds gathered outside town halls, demanding the return of the lost days, their shouts blending genuine confusion with older grievances about enclosure and taxation. The cry, "Give us our 11 days," was less a precise claim about astronomy than an expression of powerlessness, the sense that distant legislators had altered something intimate without asking leave. Pamphlets circulated, claiming the change was a plot to rob workers of wages or to advance the collection of taxes by nearly a fortnight. And though such claims lacked foundation, they found ready listeners among those already suspicious of any reform that arrived wearing the language of improvement. The disturbances remained local and short-lived, yet they revealed how completely the calendar had become entangled with the ordinary contracts of life, so that altering one seemed to threaten the rest. When the 2nd of September finally arrived, the transition passed more quietly than the rumours had predicted. Those who rose on the morning of the 14th found the same sun, the same tides, the same fields waiting to be worked. The adjustment had been absorbed into the record books and the new almanacs, and within a few seasons the double dating that had once marked correspondence with the continent began to fade from everyday use. Britain had not surrendered its independence, so much as discovered that the price of maintaining a separate chronology had grown higher than the satisfaction of keeping it. The 11 days remained a subject of occasional complaint in rural districts for a generation, preserved in family stories rather than official memory. Yet, the practical necessity of matching dates with trading partners gradually turned the form into simple fact. Even after the legal change, pockets of private reckoning persisted in isolated parishes, where the old saints' days continued to govern local festivals. Long after the printed calendars had moved on, the resistance that had once been loud enough to produce riots settled into the quieter persistence of custom, reminder that the ordering of time could be decreed from above, yet still be negotiated in the daily choices of those who lived by it. Britain's century of separation had ended not with a sudden acceptance of foreign authority, but with the recognition that the sky itself had never belonged to any single church or parliament only to the slow agreement of those willing to count the same days together. Even after Britain's long hesitation gave way to parliamentary decree, the world's calendars remained a scattered mosaic of reckonings, each nation still measuring its seasons against its own remembered past. The Julian thread, frayed but unbroken in many places, continued to pull certain societies out of step with the sun, while the Gregorian correction spread not through papal command, but through the quieter pressures of trade, railways, and the need to speak the same dates across oceans. What had once been a dispute confined to European courts now reached farther, into empires that had never counted their years from Rome, yet found themselves drawn into the same slow alignment. Japan's encounter with this question arrived during the Meiji Restoration, when the old lunar calendar, tied to imperial ceremony and agricultural festivals, began to feel like an obstacle to the modern state the reformers wished to build. In 1873, the government simply announced that the third day of the 12th month would be followed by the 1st of January in the Gregorian sequence, permitting nearly 2 weeks without public debate or riot. The change was presented as one more instrument of progress, alongside telegraphs and conscript armies, and though rural villages continued for a time to mark their ancestral observances on the older dates, the official record moved forward without looking back. The island's sudden leap forward demonstrated how a calendar could be altered not to correct astronomy, but to signal membership in a wider industrial order. China's adoption came later, and amid greater upheaval. After the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the new republic declared in 1912 that the Gregorian calendar would replace the traditional system, partly to coordinate with foreign powers, and partly to mark a decisive break with imperial tradition. Yet the transition proved uneven. City offices and schools observed the new dates, while many families still consulted the lunar almanac for weddings and ancestral rites. The dual practice persisted for decades. Revealing how official synchronization could coexist with private reckonings that answered to different rhythms of memory and belief. Russia's shift arrived with revolutionary force. After the Bolshevik seizure of power, the new regime decreed in 1918 that the day following the 31st of January would be counted as the 14th of February, erasing the 13 days by which the Julian calendar had fallen behind. Change was framed as a practical necessity for aligning the vast country with the socialist calendar of the future, Yet it also served to distance the state from the Orthodox Church that had long defended the old account. Peasants in remote provinces learned of the omission only when tax collectors or railway timetables arrived on unfamiliar dates, and the adjustment settled into daily life more through administrative pressure than through any sudden popular acceptance. By the middle of the 20th century, the remaining holdouts were few and geographically scattered. Some nations retained the Julian sequence for religious purposes, while adopting the Gregorian for civil affairs, creating internal double reckonings that required constant translation. Others moved to the corrected calendar only when colonial administrations ended, or when participation in international treaties made separate dating too costly to maintain. Final patches of resistance faded. Not because every community suddenly embraced astronomical precision, but because the cost of maintaining a separate chronology had risen beyond the comfort of local custom. In this gradual convergence lay a quiet lesson. The sky itself had never insisted on a single count, yet the web of commerce, diplomacy, shared record-keeping had finally drawn almost every corner of the earth into one continuous sequence of numbered days. Even as civil reckonings across continents drew nearer to one shared sequence, the Orthodox churches held to the older Julian measure with a quiet persistence that reached back through centuries of shared liturgy and imperial memory. In the shadowed interiors of monasteries from the slopes of Athos to the onion domes of the Russian north, the decision was never framed as resistance to astronomy alone, but as fidelity to the calculations that had once united the undivided church, Nicaea. There the fathers had fixed the date of Easter according to the Julian spring equinox, and to alter that anchor felt, to many, like loosening the very thread that bound present worship to the apostles themselves. The Gregorian reform, post, issued by a Roman pontiff whose authority those churches had long rejected, therefore arrived not as correction, but as an alien intrusion, one that threatened to shift the movable feasts and the entire rhythm of fasting and festival that shaped communal life. The result was a gap that widened with each passing year. By the 20th century, a difference at 13 days, so that the Nativity celebrated in Western churches on the 25th of December fell for the Orthodox on the 7th of January. Pascha itself sometimes drifted even farther apart, creating a visible reminder that two branches of Christianity were still reading the same sky through different reckonings. Travellers who crossed from one observance to the other could find themselves marking the same mystery twice, or missing it entirely, depending on which threshold they stepped across. This separation was never absolute. Some Orthodox communities experimented with revised calendars in the 1920s, aligning Easter yet retaining the Julian fixed feasts, yet the majority retained the old account, precisely because any compromise risked fracturing the unity they prized above astronomical exactness. Russia offers the clearest illustration of the enduring split between church and state. After the Bolshevik decree imposed the Gregorian system on civil life in 1918, the Orthodox Church continued its services according to the Julian dates, so that believers might attend a liturgy on what the railway timetable called the 25th of December, while the state observed the 12th. The same pattern repeated in Serbia, Bulgaria, and parts of the Middle East, where governments adopted the corrected calendar for diplomacy and commerce, yet left religious institutions to mark their own time. Even today, a handful of jurisdictions, including certain monasteries on Mount Athos and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, maintain the Julian sequence in full, their calendars drifting farther behind the sun with every leap year the wider world accepts. The divergence no longer provokes riots or parliamentary debates. It simply persists as a quiet parallel chronology, one that invites those who notice to wonder how one still runs silently beneath the surface of a single numbered day, even as those parallel reckonings lingered like faint echoes along monastic walls and state borders. Fractures in time itself began to surface in quieter, more peculiar corners of the record. Imagine standing at the edge of a northern forest in the early 18th century, where the light falls differently on the same stretch of days depending on which crown claims the soil. Sweden, caught between the older Julian count The newer precision, urged by its astronomers, attempted a compromise. So delicate, it unravelled into one of the strangest calendar experiments ever recorded. Rather than leap forward all at once, the kingdom resolved to omit leap days, gradually, across several decades, inching toward alignment without the shock of missing dates. Yet wars and shifting alliances interrupted the plan, leaving the realm suspended in a half-state where 1700 passed without its extra day, only for 1712 to restore an anomalous February 30 that no other nation acknowledged. Farmers marked their planting by one sequence, while royal ledgers followed another. Travellers crossing into Denmark or Russia discovered they had aged or grown younger overnight, papers suddenly out of step with local reckonings. The episode left behind scattered parish registers and court documents that historians still pass with a mixture of amusement and caution. Reminders that even the most careful adjustment can drift into folklore when interrupted by human affairs. From such deliberate missteps, the stories multiply outward, touching lives whose very beginnings resist precise placement. Consider how the shift in Britain and its colonies in 1752 erased 11 days from September, so that a child born on the 10th of that month might appear in one set of family papers, yet vanish from another, depending on whether the scribe adopted the new style or clung to the old. Figures like George Washington, recorded birth straddles the colonial transition, carry forward this ambiguity into legend. Early accounts place the event on the 11th, on the 22nd, each tied to whether the writer observed the Julian or Gregorian frame. Similar uncertainties cling to artists and thinkers whose papers crossed borders or languages during the slow spread of reform, their baptismal entries floating between two possible anniversaries and inviting later scholars to weigh probability rather than certainty. These are not mere clerical errors, but traces of a deeper dislocation, where the same person could be said to have entered the world under two different skies, each carrying its own chain of feast days and obligations. Beyond individual births, entire stretches of collective experience slipped into a kind of historical limbo. When Britain finally aligned its civil calendar in 1752, the days between the 2nd and 14th of September were legislated out of existence, so that riots broke out among those who believed their lives had been shortened or their rents unfairly collected. Yet the more enduring strangeness lies in the events that, technically, never occurred within that year's sequence. No recorded transactions, no court sessions, no births or deaths officially logged on those vanished dates. In the archives they stand as blank intervals, gaps, that later researchers fill with inference or leave respectfully empty. Similar voids appear in Swedish documents from the botched transition years, where a single anomalous date, like February 30, floats outside the ordinary grid, forcing modern readers to decide whether it belongs to history at all, or merely to the realm of administrative imagination. Edge cases accumulate further. When one considers communities that adopted the change at different speeds, such as remote parishes in the Alps or trading posts along the Baltic, where a contract signed on a date that existed only locally could later be contested in distant courts operating under another count. These anomalies invite a lingering curiosity about how many other quiet discrepancies still thread through the past. A letter dated in one style might have been answered days earlier or later, depending on the recipient's calendar, altering the perceived urgency of its contents. Pilgrimages or markets scheduled by the older reckoning could coincide with entirely different seasons under the newer one, shifting their meaning without anyone intending the change. Even today, when we reach for a single numbered day to anchor our sense of shared time, these older fractures remind us that the surface uniformity conceals layers of adjustment, resistance, and occasional invention. The stories persist not as corrections to be smoothed away, but as invitations to notice how fragile any single chronology remains when measured against the longer rhythms of sun, season, and human memory. Yet, in that fragility lies a quiet lesson about the calendars we inherit and reshape, for what we call time has never been a fixed gift from the heavens, but a human invention hammered out across centuries of observation, dispute, necessity. The Julian arrangement that once stretched days across the Roman world, the Gregorian correction that later trimmed them away, even the partial experiments in Sweden or the delayed adoptions in Orthodox lands, all emerged from the same impulse to align our counting with the sun's slow return and the moon's phases, tools crafted not to capture eternity but to organize planting, taxation, prayer within the limits of what eyes and instruments could measure. No single system arrived complete. Each bore the fingerprints of astronomers arguing over fractions of a day, of popes weighing tradition against accuracy, rulers balancing diplomacy with the seasons their subjects actually felt. We continue that same work of adjustment today. The changes arrive in smaller increments and often pass unnoticed. Seconds are inserted every few years to keep atomic clocks from drifting ahead of the Earth's irregular spin, a modern echo of the leap days, once debated in medieval councils. Time zones themselves shift with political borders rather than pure geography, daylight-saving experiments still flicker on and off across continents, reminding us that even the hour we glance at on a screen remains subject to collective agreement rather than immutable law. These tweaks rarely provoke riots now, yet they surface the same underlying truth the vanished October days once illustrated. Our shared chronology is a living agreement, open to revision. Whenever the mismatch between numbers and sky grows too wide to ignore, these long centuries of tinkering ultimately invite is appreciation for the fragile architecture that lets us speak of the same Wednesday, or the same equinox across oceans and languages. Without such synchronized systems, the letters, contracts, pilgrimages, and baubles that once crossed calendar borders would lose their common reference points, and the historical record itself would dissolve into the very gaps and double dates that still puzzle scholars. The stories of lost weeks and anomalous Februaries do not merely entertain. They underscore how much we rely on these invented grids to coordinate everything from global trade to personal memory, while also revealing how readily those grids can be redrawn when necessity or authority demands it. If the journey through these vanished days has stirred your curiosity about how time itself bends under human hands, we would be grateful if you would like this video. Leave a comment sharing where you are listening from, subscribe to the channel, so that future explorations of overlooked history reach you without delay. Port helps keep these quiet corners of the past alive for listeners everywhere.